Hi, I'm Whitney Belker with Miami's Global Connection. Our show is designed to raise public awareness of the interdependent world in which we live. We focus on local leaders who are involved in diverse international issues and projects. The sponsor of our show is the Greater Miami chapter of the United Nations Association of the U.S., otherwise known as the UNA. The UNA is a grassroots organization devoted to informing and educating the public about the critical services provided by the UN. It is the nation's largest nonpartisan foreign policy organization with a network of 26,000 members and 176 community-based chapters. Today we have several distinguished guests, including Mr. Lee Sandler, founding member of Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg law firm. Mr. Sandler has served in the past 5 administrations advising on international trade and negotiations, and he has specialized in international trade regulations. Mr. Quinter, partner in charge of Customs and International Trade of Becker and Poliakoff law firm. He previously served as an attorney to U.S. Customs Service. Additionally, joining us today is Mrs. Nancy Cely-Icaza, Ecuadorian Trade Commissioner, who previously served as Vice Minister of Fisheries and has also represented Ecuador in a variety of international trade negotiations. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about some of the new threats that many of our companies here in the U.S. have to consider concerning bioterrorism. And Mr. Sandler, I understand that you have been very involved in the negotiation process. Perhaps you can start us off by explaining how this whole new Bioterrorism Act came about.
Well, the Congress for many years has been concerned about policing our borders to protect our food supply in the United States. So prior to September 11th, there were a variety of legislative efforts to try and increase the policing of food. One fact alone that would gather the attention of a congressman is that we have 300 ports of entry, and at that time probably about 50 import inspectors employed by the Food and Drug Administration. So there's no way that they could police the imports that were coming into the country if they were in fact going to be looking at shipments. After September 11th, with the clear concerns that the nation has over the anti-terrorism issues, the Congress was able to fashion some legislation, moved it forward, and gave it over to the Food and Drug Administration, telling them that they had until December the 12th of 2003 to put in place regulations that would implement a new methodology for policing food when it's brought into the United States and when it's actually distributed in the United States.
So why is this such a hot issue today?
Well, the reason hot issue today is that the Congress tends to think that any solution it comes up with is a good solution. And so legislation that was passed was not as well thought out as it might have been. The second problem with it is that the Food and Drug Administration is not an agency which has a history of trying to balance the facilitation of trade with the policing of the products that it tries to police. And consequently, we have them coming up with a proposal that was totally out of balance. Proposals that were unrealistic, that did not consult with the business community to learn how the businesses operate, to try and figure out how to take advantage of what companies are already doing to police their own products. Instead, came up with a lot of procedures which were very costly, very inefficient, very disruptive of trade. So those were proposed quite some time ago, and now we've been involved in quite a long battle in trying to get them to roll out a different methodology.
Okay, and so thinking on in terms of food and why should the viewers be concerned about this new Bioterrorism Act, and how could it possibly impact us? I mean, what's there to really think about here?
Well, probably the short answer to that is that it's probably not safe to assume that what they're doing is really going to be sufficient to protect against a real bioterrorism threat to the food supply. But it's probably misguided in many respects. For example, they are focusing upon developing information on every shipment that comes into the United States, millions of transactions.
And I understand the infrastructure is not currently up to speed in terms of being able to monitor.
Sure, but even if it was, focusing upon the entities is probably a better approach to using whatever limited resources.
When you say the entities, what do you refer to?
looking at on a selectivity basis, looking at who is supplying the food, where it comes from, looking at you have repetitive shipments that come across the border all the time, the same people importing the same thing. You really don't have to police every one of those transactions. You don't need a wealth of information about every one of those transactions. Law enforcement agencies typically rely upon understanding who it is they're dealing with. They get leaks in advance of information. They find out different ways to develop data that would be helpful for them to make their decisions on enforcement. Here we have a rule that was developed by the Food and Drug Administration consistent with the statute, which requires them to develop a huge amount of information on every shipment, no matter how repetitive it comes in, no matter how often they know the information.
When you say them, who is actually going to be responsible for policing these efforts? Does this fall into the category of customs? I mean, what's the infrastructure? Perhaps Mr. Quinter, you have some.
I think the first question is, what's the impact? Why should people be concerned? Simple. Food prices are going up. The regulations take effect December 12th, and after that, they expect the food prices will increase here in the United States. And as far as the agencies responsible, as Mr. Sandler mentioned, the Food and Drug Administration and the United States Customs Service, which is now called Customs and Border Protection, are the two main agencies responsible. The problem, as Lee's explained, is and here at the Miami International Airport, when you have a flight landing every minute, but whether it's passenger, which has cargo aboard, or freighter, which is only cargo, or at the seaport, where you have ships arriving, departing daily, there are 2,000 containers on board.
How is it even feasible for our current infrastructure to monitor and inspect 2,000 cargo containers?
You can't do it. This new procedure is supposed to help the government identify suspicious shipments, and those will be examined, both at the airport and the seaport.
And so what happens as a potential, say I'm a potential exporter from, pick a country, Ecuador, and my container's detained because of a suspicious shipment. What's the procedure, and what is the impact or potential impact, even if I'm not guilty of anything?
First thing, I think we have to mention that the regulations take effect December 12th. What that means is any company involved in the food supply chain to the United States must register with the FDA before that date. And if they don't, it's a prohibited act, and that means the food will be detained by the Food and Drug Administration.
Wow, so it looks like a lot of companies have a lot of work to do. And what are the procedures? You have to register?
There's a one-time registration by every company involved, whether it's domestic in the United States or foreign. And then there's a prior notice submission that has to be sent. If it's by air, the prior notice has to be submitted to the FDA electronically through the Internet 4 hours prior to the arrival of the food at Miami International Airport. Or if it's an ocean shipment, 8 hours ahead of the arrival of the food here at Miami Seaport.
So this sounds like a lot of extra steps in the international trade process. What percentage of companies out there currently doing business with the United States is aware of these new regulations?
Well, Becker and Poliakoff in Latin Trade Magazine just did a study, which we revealed 2 weeks ago. And that, unfortunately, revealed that among food companies in the Americas, from Chile through Canada, even the food executives are unaware of the bioterrorism law, or if they're aware of it, they don't know what it really means.
Right. And Mrs. Cely-Icaza, speaking on behalf of Ecuadorian companies, what do you anticipate how this will impact your trade with the United States?
It's very complicated because there are many steps, if you want to call it, that you have to fulfill in order to keep on selling to the United States. Only the first one is the registration that Mr. Quinter already mentioned. But the problem even with the registration is that it has to be done in English. Then you start with the first barrier, the barrier of language.
The barriers.
Yes. So we have a problem. We need our people to know exactly how to fill those forms. We know we are going to have a lot of problems because according to the regulations, if you are already exporting and you